He was probably drinking heavily at most stages in his adult life.
He liked being around young women.
The Nazi mass rallies are essentially theatrical stagings.
Tolstoy is the archetypal repentant nobleman.
It's basically absorbed into Macbeth.
His father, his uncles, his grandfathers, they all die. No role models.
Welcome to the Canon Club with Paul Morland and Ed West, exploring the Western canon in art, music and literature, one life at a time. This week...
Till one day, pretty much on a whim, he decided he was going to accompany his elder brother down to the Caucasus, where he was serving as an officer in the Russian army. It's a total failure because actually they don't really know the Russian peasantry. He brings his young bride, who is 17. He's 34 by this time. He was Russia's best paid author. He made an absolute mint from it. There were a lot of young women stuck in unhappy marriages who immediately identify with Anna because she's such a warm, sympathetic character.
Anna Karenina.
The novel Anna Karenina was published by Count Leo Tolstoy in 1878. It tells the story of an adulterous affair between Anna, a respectable, married upper-class woman, and a young officer, Count Vronsky. Anna, torn between duty and passion, cannot resist the latter and is drawn to her destruction. It is also the story of Count Levin, a character in no small part based on Tolstoy himself, struggling in his estate with the forces of tradition and progress, idealism and pragmatism. In capturing the condition of Russia, Anna Karenina was an immediate success and is considered by many the greatest novel ever written. Rosamund Bartlett has written a biography of Tolstoy and has translated Anna Karenina. Rosamund, welcome and thank you for joining us. When I first picked up Anna Karenina about 40 years ago, I was immediately entranced in a way I've never been entranced by a similar novel. And I think about it, funnily enough, and maybe this is a bit off the wall, in the same way that I encountered the Borodin symphonies or Repin as an artist. It's as if something traditional, something separate from Europe has suddenly collided with European cultural traditions and has found a voice of extraordinary vigor, colour and excitement. Does that make sense to you?
I think so, absolutely, because what Russian culture brings is something rather different to anything in the Western European tradition. And the art, the music and the literature developed along very different lines to those in England, France, Germany, Italy. And we had very little awareness of what was going on in Russian culture, in the Russian arts, until really the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th. And so it was an incredible impact that the novels of the Russians made. And when we got to know some of the paintings of artists like Repin, for example, and we heard Russian music. And I think it was all a bit confronting to begin with because there was something so vital about it. And that comes from the peculiar circumstances in which Russian culture evolved.
Could you tell us a bit about the family background of Tolstoy? I mean, I know he was from a grand, prestigious background and they were involved in Russian politics since Peter the Great, although I understand there was a dispute over where the ultimate sort of ancestors came from, and it's always been questioned.
Yeah, Tolstoy was very proud of his ancestry. Family meant a great deal to him. It's quite obvious in Anna Karenina how much the importance of family is. And he came from a rather illustrious lineage on both his father's and mother's side. His mother in particular was born a Volkonsky, and this was a very, very distinguished family. His father was a Tolstoy. And again, this was a family which could trace its history back several centuries. And there was a very famous Tolstoy who was a confidant of Peter the Great, who played a rather crucial role in bringing the the wayward son of Peter the Great back to St. Petersburg. And this was in the early 18th century. And then he sort of fell foul of the subsequent rulers and got exiled to the Solovetsky Islands up in the north. It later became an infamous labor camp. The family then had its fortunes restored, and the title Count wasn't quite as illustrious as the princess and princesses of Russian aristocracy. It was a new title brought in the 18th century when Peter the Great was westernizing Russia, but nevertheless, it was, it meant that he came from the upper echelons of Russian society. And Tolstoy's father married a Volkonsky, and so we have both lines of the family. The Tolstoys were rather impoverished by the time Tolstoy's father got married. The Volkonskys had a rather beautiful estate in Tula province, and that became Tolstoy's ancestral home. And it was a sort of typical country estate in the sort of manorial style, with a lot of lands and serfs who worked on it. Most of Tolstoy's childhood, he didn't even question his background, and it was only when he became a young man and went to university and started to travel that he began to think about the particular circumstances in which he'd grown up, and began to question whether it was legitimate to have such privileges.
Let's talk about his early years, his childhood, and particularly his time in the army. Run us through the sorts of places he grew up and particularly the estate he was born in, and also what his army experiences were like and what they taught him.
So he was born in 1828. This is the reign of Nicholas I. And he was born on the ancestral estate of Yasna Polyana, which translates as clear glade. Very, very beautiful part of Russia, not far from the city of Tula, which was always a center for weapons production. He grew up in a family where he had two elder brothers and a younger sister. And what was really striking about his childhood, that sort of cut against the grain of the privilege, was that he lost both his mother and his father at a young age. So his mother died when he was 2, and his father when he was 7. So the children were orphaned, and they'd spent a little bit of time in Moscow, but then they were packed off to Kazan on the Volga River to be brought up by their aunts. This is where Tolstoy went to university, but he was sort of wayward from an early age. In fact, all the Tolstoy children were quite eccentric in their ways, and Lev no exception. So he dropped out of university after a short period and came back to his country estate, which he'd inherited when he came of age, and led a really dissolute life until one day, pretty much on a whim, he decided he was going to accompany his elder brother, Nikolai, down to the Caucasus, where he was serving as an officer in the Russian army. And for a while, Tolstoy just sort of had a nice time. And then he decided to enlist and got his commission a few years later. And it's down in the Caucasus where the Russian army was trying to quell the Chechen uprisings that had been going on for decades at that point. And he started to write, and he sent off his first piece of fiction to the best-known publication in St. Petersburg, a monthly journal where all Russian writers published their work. And he didn't decide his name, he just signed it with his initials, and it was immediately accepted. And there was a great demand for high quality literature and a desire to find new writers. And so he immediately attracted attention. He wrote a few other short stories that were born of his experience of the Russian attempts to win over this land. They'd been losing against the Chechens for a long time, and then they finally hit upon the idea of sort of just cutting down the trees and raising whole mountainsides. And so one of these early stories is called The Wood Felling. And it meant that these guerrillas basically had nowhere to hide. And so he writes a few very vivid stories that come out of his early experiences. And then when he gets his commission, he's actually thinking about already retiring, but he's transferred to what is now Romania because of the beginning of the Crimean War. And eventually he's transferred to Sebastopol, and he's in the artillery, and he serves with distinction when he's at the front. And it's here that he writes 3 pieces of very important war reportage, which are really quite unprecedented in their vivid detail. And the first one is greeted with great enthusiasm by the Russian government and translated into French. But by the time he's written the third one, his views on warfare have changed because he's seen it up close. And he's seen how demoralized the Russian infantry are. This is basically Russian peasants who are paid almost nothing and have to serve under very difficult conditions with very outdated equipment. And so he tries to think about reform and also begins to develop some sort of pacifist ideas. And the third of the pieces of reportage, the third of the Sebastopol stories, is heavily mutilated by the censor. So that's his first experience of coming up against the Russian government for voicing what are going to be very unpopular views. In fact, at the end of Anna Karenina, there's a sort of direct trajectory one could trace there. He comes to St. Petersburg towards the end of the Crimean War, after the siege of Sebastopol is almost over, and begins to meet writers for the first time. And he's a completely new voice in Russian letters at that point.
I was interested to read how revered he is in Chechnya, and that even during the more recent conflicts, that the museum was still maintained in Grozny, even in 2000. So after the reforms of Alexander II and the liberation of the serfs, his writing in the 1870s, we know that it's going to all end in tragedy and disaster. But can you tell us about the mood in Russia at this point, and particularly with class conflict that was ever growing, and how he positioned himself in this? Because obviously he was a landowner, but he was an eccentric one in his views.
Just a word about how revered he is down in Chechnya. It's because he wrote with unfailing interest in other peoples. So he wasn't the sort of typical Russian romantic writer who was a sort of colonialist in that sense. And his sympathy for the locals was something which really won him a lot of admirers in that part of the world. He wrote a novella called The Cossacks in 1863. I mean, he'd been working on it for quite a while, and it was published in 1863. So it's sort of rather later on that people began to see that here was this young man who was really attempting to get inside the way of life of people who were totally different to the Russians. And that was something completely new in Russian literature. But to come back to the events of the 1860s and all the reforms. So they begin to happen already when Tolstoy is coming back from the Crimean War in 1855, because Nicholas I has died that February, and he's been succeeded by Alexander II. In Russian, we talk about Alexander II as the Tsar liberator, because he was the one who finally introduced reforms. And it's probably not the case that he was born a reformer, but he realized, because the Crimean War was such a fiasco for the Russians and exposed how backward the country really was, that reform was inevitable. And this begins already in the 1850s, when Alexander becomes Tsar, with an amnesty to the Decembrists still stuck out in Siberia, the ones who'd survived. and the lifting of censorship. This brought a great feeling of optimism, and there was a sort of sense of the ice finally beginning to move, because Nicholas I had been so unbelievably repressive, particularly towards the end of the 1840s, when you've got revolutions going throughout Europe. This is the time when Dostoevsky was arrested for hearing a letter about socialist ideas. You know, he'd been sent off to Siberia himself to do hard labor. So there was this tremendous feeling of optimism in the air. And the most important event, of course, is the abolition of serfdom. And it actually happens when Tolstoy is abroad. But literature plays a very, very important part in all of this, because in the late 1840s, there are these progressive critics who see literature as the only place for discussing progressive ideas. So the letter that got Dostoevsky into trouble was by the great critic Belinsky. He was Russia's first professional critic. And he was sort of arguing that, you know, that Russia needed rights and laws, not sort of sermons and prayers. For the next few years, there are a number of very important works which are published, beginning with Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, which is published in 1862, which is the year after the abolition of serfdom, and really shows the ferment in Russia following this great event. And Turgenev attempts to depict a new hero from this revolutionary generation, these sort of hard-minded scientists. And yet, if you know that novel, you know that Bazarov ends. And as a result of Turgenev's novel, the radical critic Chernyshevsky writes a very inflammatory novel called What Is to Be Done in 1863. He writes it in prison before he's sent off to Siberia. And he's trying to create a positive revolutionary hero who's going to be advocating for further reform and for women's equality, for socialism. These are all in the background to Anna Karenina. And you've got, at the same time, this is the early 1860s, and Dostoevsky's come back from exile, and he's beginning to turn against Chernyshevsky and Turgenev and the whole of Western thought, really, beginning with notes from Underground. And then he'll go on to develop those ideas in Crime and Punishment in 1866. But at the same time, Tolstoy is writing War and Peace, which seems like a bit of a paradox, because all the Russian writers around him are very occupied with the current state of Russia and where Russia's going. And he seems to be the only one who is going back to an earlier generation. And so the 1860s is a time when Russian society really begins to open up. They bring in law courts for the first time. You know, we see professional lawyers, we see the rise of medicine, very, very little autonomy given to local government, but we see the beginnings of something called the Zemstvo, which is a kind of local council, and they administer education and beginnings of a health service. And these are all there in the background too, to Anna Karenina. And then we see, moving on, that Alexander II, of course, doesn't go very far enough. And you see a lot of earnest young reformers who want Russia to embrace socialism. And we see in 1873, which is the year in which Tolstoy begins Anna Karenina, thousands of idealistic young people literally going to the countryside and trying to get the peasantry to embrace socialism. And they're hoping to sort of totally bypass capitalism. And it's a total failure, because actually they don't really know the Russian peasantry. And the typical Russian peasant is actually, despite having been suffering such awful treatment from the hands of the Russian government, is very, very loyal to the government and the Tsar. We then move on to the 1870s, and that is the decade in which Tolstoy writes Anna Karenina. And really, it's a mess, isn't it? Because the reforms have opened up Pandora's box, and they're beginning to allow some movement in Russian society of his own. There's beginnings of industrialization. There are a lot of wonderful new cultural institutions which are instituted during these years. There is, the beginnings of a conservatoire education for musicians. There is a new theatre in St. Petersburg, but on the same time, there are great limits to what is possible. And, we're still living in an absolutist monarchy. There is no parliament. There is just a Senate, which really doesn't have any kind of legislative power at all. And so this is the background to the beginnings of Anna Karenina, which is set, unlike War and Peace, in the here and now. And that's incredibly important, that the novel reflects events as they're unfolding in Russia at the time.
I think there's so much in that, Rosamund. It's so interesting, such a rich history. The fact that Lenin also wrote a book called What Is to Be Done. The fact that there was an extremely important correspondence between Marx and Vera Zasulich about whether Marxism could be revised in the conditions of Russia. These were really important questions, and we're going to come back to them. We're going to dive into Anna Karenina very soon. But before we do, can we just take stock of Tolstoy's literary reputation on the eve of his starting Anna Karenina? And that, of course, means talking a little bit about War and Peace, his other great novel.
Yes, and for many people, his greatest novel. I think the jury is out as to which is the greater work. So Tolstoy was very struck by the changes in Russian society when they started to happen in the late 1850s. And he happened to have a relative who was amongst the returning Decembrists. And he'd been pursuing a relatively conventional career as a writer, although he was rubbing everyone up the wrong way. So he got to meet Turgenev when he first came to St. Petersburg. Turgenev was 10 years older, and they'd been corresponding already. And Turgenev very genially put Tolstoy up and was a little bit disconcerted by his young guest going out partying at all hours and not sort of living the life of a respectable writer. And Tolstoy immediately sort of did not want to be a sort of clubbable kind of writer. He never really joined any kind of movement. And he soon found that his sort of eccentric views weren't ones that were very welcome. So he didn't want to join any of the sort of progressive critics. He was the sort of patriarchal landowner at this point. So he ends up retreating to his estate at Yasna Polyana fairly soon. He doesn't like city life either. He prefers to be at home in the countryside. In fact, I think someone calculated that he spent 70 out of his 82 years living at Yasna Polyana. And he attempts to bring about reform. He's already, before all the reforms, tried to give the peasants some more freedom, and they're very suspicious of him. And at the same time, he is using his droits de seigneur. He's fathered a son with one of the peasant girls on the estate. But he soon realizes that actually, for him, there's not much point to all these reforms if the peasants around him in the villages can't read and write. And he soon becomes totally passionate about the mission of education. So he's been writing stories and novellas in a conventional way, but they're not sort of, they're not written with a huge amount of passion. But suddenly this topic of education really grips him, and he opens up a little school on his estate and is regarded with a great deal of suspicion by all the landowners around him. And he's already been getting a bit of opposition from his neighbors because he's been appointed sort of intermediary. He's been probably the wrong person to be appointed for this job, to sort of helps smooth over the transition with the emancipation of the serfs. And he's on the side of the peasants. Unlike all the landowners around him who are deeply conservative and don't want to give up their privileges, Tolstoy is the archetypal repentant nobleman in that sense. And so his mission to open a school is testament to that. And so he starts getting his young kids to come and learn the alphabet. And he's very, very unusual from the beginning because education, such as it was, and there was very little education, particularly for the peasantry in Russia, it was done by rote learning and corporal punishment. And from the very beginning, Tolstoy says to his peasant children, well, you can turn up when you want, you can leave when you want. And he brings them into the learning process. They write stories together and he publishes a journal. And it takes off and he starts opening other stories and employing students who have been expelled from university in Moscow because they're a little bit too politically active. And so we've got a kind of sort of hotbed of progressive ideas in the early 1860s. And eventually the Tsar's secret police descend on Yasna Polyana. And Tolstoy is absolutely affronted by this because, he's a Russian aristocrat and how dare they come into his private land. And he writes a letter to Alexander II. He will write letters to every single one of the Russian Tsars from Alexander II onwards to Nicholas II. And he gets progressively less respectful of them as time goes on. And he's so offended that he, in his mercurial way, he just simply drops his schools and goes off and gets married. And that is instrumental to the genesis of War and Peace, because he could not have probably conceived that huge novel without the domestic stability that marriage provided. So we get to know a little bit about how he got married from the chapters in Anna Karenina, which outline Levin's courtship of Kitty. So that is very much drawing on his own life. So he brings his young bride, who is 17, he's 34 by this time, this is in the early 1860s, back to Yasna Polyana. And she has grown up in the Kremlin, where her father's been a doctor. She doesn't come from a particularly noble background. Her mother, in fact, is illegitimate. Her father does not, as a doctor, come from an elite background either. And she's very subservient to Tolstoy at this point, but she's given the responsibility for running the household. And she encounters a very Spartan living accommodation, which she does her best to make a little bit more comfortable. And for the 1860s, she's having children, and Tolstoy is soon very happy for the first time in his life, probably. And, well, he's just beginning. This gives him the circumstances where she's running the household and he can just get on with writing and he's got no distractions. And she's stuck actually at home looking after the children and, running the kitchen. And he can go off to Moscow and do research and interview people who have fought in 1812. And what happens is that he's beginning to think that he wants to write a novel, first of all, about the returning Decembrists in the 1850s. And then he realizes that if he's going to try and really explain all of that, he needs to go back in time. And so he goes first back to 1805 to put everything into a context, and then to 1812 and the great collision with Napoleon. Because, of course, it was after the defeat of Napoleon that the Russian officers went to Paris and began to see that Russia was really very, very backward compared to Western Europe. And Alexander I had been talking all the time about, introducing liberal reforms. He'd had this liberal education, and yet after the defeat of Napoleon, he became actually more reactionary, and they became bitterly disappointed and began to plot this uprising, which is the Decembrist uprising in 1825. So that is why Tolstoy goes all the way back, because he wants to really understand it. And he ends up, of course, writing this epic Homeric novel, which really ends in 1825. He never takes it to the present day, which had been his original intention. It was extremely successful indeed, and it was a novel published in installments like the other great Russian novels, and was widely read and made Tolstoy Russia's best-known living novelist.
You refer to him as Russia's Homer. Sorry, it's a very ignorant question, but is that a widely used phrase? I mean, is that?
I don't know. I think we just applied that epithet to the novelist because it's so epic. Its sweep is unlike anything else in Russian literature.
I think moving on to Anna Karenina, could you please sort of give us for the listeners, a brief outline of the novel? Obviously, it's not too easy, and the themes, and especially the interrelated plots involving Levin and Anna. Yes, if you could do that in 100 words, that would be...
Yeah, I think it'd be good to talk about how he came to writing the novel, because he had a bit of depression after the end of War and Peace. You can imagine once he'd completed it, he didn't really know what to do with himself, and for a while he threw himself back into education and opened his school up again and wanted to publish a primer for Russian children of all backgrounds. And I think it's rather wonderful to think that he went from that great epic novel to the letters of the alphabet. So this was something he really threw his energies into. And then again, he was drawn back to fiction in the early 1870s. He toyed with the idea of writing a novel about Peter the Great, but couldn't sympathize with him. And he was very taken with the idea of the topic of women's liberation. He'd come across John Stuart Mill's 1869 essay on the subjection of women. There was something that was written by Alexandre Dumas fils. And in 1872, the year before he started Anna Karenina, he went to the autopsy of a young woman who had thrown herself in front of a goods train at the railway station just near his home at Yasinki. And then he happened to pick up one day a Pushkin work, which began, the guests arrived at the dacha. And he was so struck with the way in which Pushkin just sort of began without any sort of preamble, that all those things sort of collided into the idea of writing a novel about a woman who commits adultery. And it took off from there. And he went through very many drafts before he really hit upon the novel as we know it now, and the beginning that we know now. And it was the fourth draft that he actually gave the title Roman, which is the Russian for novel. It's from the French. And that's quite a striking title, because none of the great Russian fictional masterpieces had followed traditional European genres. So he was consciously writing a novel, although when you get to the end of it, you think actually he's sort of taking issue with the whole idea of a Western European novel, almost parodying it. So in this novel, we have a lot of different stories. So it is difficult to summarize, because actually Tolstoy couldn't really find sustained inspiration in telling the story of a Russian aristocratic woman having an adulterous affair with an army officer. That just sort of didn't hold his attention. His wife, Sonia, who was the one who was dutifully copying out the manuscripts, loved it because it was, something that was very readable, a lot of suspense and romance. But for Tolstoy, he needed more. And that's how the character of Levin comes in. And then in the end, we have actually three main marriages in this novel, and they're all variations on the theme of love and marriage. So we have Dolly and Oblonsky. So this is Kitty's sister, Dolly, who is married to Anna's brother, Steva Oblonsky. And that isn't all, because Tolstoy is really interested in interrogating the whole idea of the position of women. So there are other people as well we encounter. There is a young unmarried woman called Varenka who becomes a friend of Kitty when she's recovering from being spurned by Vronsky. And there are various society women in St. Petersburg. So there are a lot of characters in this novel, and we see all of their stories proceeding in an interwoven way. And we'll have Tolstoy following the story of Anna and Vronsky, and then picking up with Levin and so on until we get to the end of part 8, and it's a long novel. So I don't want to give the game away about what happens, or was that what you'd like me to tell the plot? I wasn't
I don't
quite
think
sure
we
what
need
you...
a spoiler alert, although I imagine most people know how it ends, or a spoiler alert. But perhaps you can tell us about the condition of Russia as it's reflected. We talked about this already, but specifically as it's reflected in the Levin story. And then perhaps we can talk a little bit more about Anna.
Right. So if you read the great writer Vladimir Nabokov's essay on Anna Karenina, which is a very well-known piece of criticism, you'll see that he delights in pinning the novel to the current events of Russia in the 1870s. And so he's really making it clear that Tolstoy was writing in the present day. So Levin is running an agricultural business on his farm. He's a farmer essentially, and he's grappling with all the problems that the emancipation have brought, because no one really quite knows where they're going and what their position is, and he doesn't quite know how to deal with his peasants. And like Tolstoy, he's someone who sympathizes with them, and there is a big contrast drawn between him and Vronsky in the novel, because later on, Vronsky and Anna return from their period in Italy, and Vronsky sets up a sort of model farm, and he's importing all this brand new Western machinery. He brings in a German steward. He brings in even cows from Switzerland for his farm. And we see Tolstoy's view of all of this through the eyes, quite significantly, of Oblonsky's wife, Dolly, who comes to visit Anna. And she finds it a very unsettling experience in all kinds of different ways. And during the chapters that are devoted to this visit, there is a dinner where they're discussing all these new innovations and things. So Vronsky is someone who is very different to Levin, because he's a bit nouveau riche. You know, he's got a lot of wealth, so he's just throwing the money around. He's building a hospital, but not a maternity wing, which is very appalling for Dolly. And Levin is battling away with tried and trusted methods. He's very interested to know about all these new things, but he's convinced that these foreign innovations can only bring harm to Russia, and that's really, really crucial. And most importantly, of course, he gets involved. One of the best bits of the whole novel, from my view, is when he goes mowing with his peasants. And really, when we're young, we throw ourselves into reading this novel and get very swept away by the amazing romance between Anna and Vronsky. But actually, the most lyrical, beautiful writing is devoted to the Russian countryside and the chapters where Levin is working with his peasants. And it's an extraordinary piece of writing. So he is trying to really resist all these Western innovations, and yet, of course, he and the peasants around him are really at a loss to know quite what the next step is because of the reforms being such a mess. The peasants have been left off, even worse off after being emancipated than they were before. The nobility are worse off because they've lost their income. So no one really is happy with the situation.
And there is this sense of Vronsky with his imports, a sense of Westernism being superficiality, glibness, quick and easy solutions that won't really take in Russia. And yet at the same time, Levin doesn't have all the answers. He's trying to find them in a more authentically Russian way. But I think Tolstoy is trying to say to us, we have to find these answers ourselves, but it's not in some easy answer by looking at our own traditions. We have to struggle our way. And he doesn't have the answers. Levin doesn't have the answers, but he's pretty persuaded that you can't just cut and paste from the West and graft that onto Russia. That won't take either.
Absolutely. And I think it's quite interesting to think about the intrusion of Western technology in the form of trains, for example. It's hard nowadays to read a novel in which there was a train and not just take it for granted, but this was something totally new and revolutionary in Russia at this time. Russia's industrialization came so much later than England's, for example. The first little bit of railway was being laid when there were already extensive networks in England, for example. And the fact that in 1867, just a few years before Tolstoy started Anna Karenina, they established a little railway station near his estate, meant that he was sort of hyper aware. He hated the intrusion of all this Western technology into the rural life of Russia. He nevertheless got on the train when it suited him to go to Moscow. But it's a very interesting thing to look at how railways are portrayed in Anna Karenina in very different ways, and they perform a symbolic function too. So, Anna meets Vronsky at a railway station. This is something we are immediately aware of at the beginning of the novel. And then we have a link with violence and death, because they both are aware of a peasant being killed at the station when they first meet each other in Moscow. And that's quite critical. And then later on, we learn that Oblonsky is going to get a job on the railways because he's so much in debt. And that is seen as something not terribly positive. The children play at railways. So we have throughout the novel a kind of network of associations with trains and the West and modernity and death, for example.
Could you tell us a little bit about the kind of critical response and the impact it had in the immediate years and later on as sort of Russia headed towards this great disaster or change, however you want to phrase it?
So finally, Tolstoy was ready to start sending some of the earlier chapters off to press. And this time he published with a fairly conservative monthly journal that was edited by someone called Mikhail Katkov. And he struck a very good deal. He was Russia's best paid author by this stage. He made an absolute mint from it. And it all went quite well, except that he was falling prone increasingly to self-doubt as he wrote the novel and found it difficult to continue. For a start, there was a lot of personal tragedy that befell the Tolstoy family while he was writing. So both his aunts died in those years, and he lost several children, and he lost also the daughter of his wife's sister, Tanya, to whom he was very close, and his brother Sergei also lost a child. So there was a lot of tragedy on the personal front that's in the background, which I think is reflected in the sort of darkening mood of the novel as it progresses. And then Tolstoy himself just got more and more depressed, like Levin, who, he has to go and hide the gun because he feels so bad. So he's falling prone to self-doubt. And that has the effect that he actually can't carry on with the publication. And so he's leaving his readers on a cliffhanger, and they all love it. And there are a lot of young women stuck in unhappy marriages who immediately identify with Anna because she's such a warm, sympathetic character. And she gives them courage because she's someone who is ready to defy society and all its hypocrisies. And Russia is a very, very conservative society. The government has a vested interest in maintaining domestic stability, thinking that equates with political stability. So women are very much subservient to their husbands. That's enshrined in law. So it's very hard for Tolstoy's readers to be reading, and then suddenly, there's a gap of months and years before he's able to continue. Finally, he gets back and carries on, and he's already sort of lost heart to a great or lesser extent. And then, right at the end, events in Russia also have an impact on the way in which the novel is published, because we see the Serbo-Turkish War erupting in 1876. This is really important. And Vronsky, after Anna's tragic end, enlists. And of course, he goes off on a train. Oh, I forgot to mention, of course, the other fatal association of trains and Anna's tragic end, which is not a coincidence. Tolstoy, through Levin, who is very much his alter ego, starts expressing Tolstoy's increasingly anti-militaristic views of pacifism, arguing, along with the old prince, Kitty's father, that the Russian people don't want to go to war, and pillorying this volunteer movement, which is covering patriotic feelings for fellow Slavs. He's dismissing it as a sort of, just a sort of fashionable pastime for the ideal rich, which does not go down well with his editor, who is deeply conservative and is one of these people who is, trying to come out with views on behalf of fellow Slavs in Serbia and all the other Slavic nations. And then, of course, Russia joins the war, Russo-Turkish War, 1877. And Katkov simply refuses to publish Part 8, where we see Vronsky going off to war and all these things being discussed. So Tolstoy is obliged to publish Part 8 separately, and it causes a bit of a scandal. But of course, that just makes the novel even more popular. And it was the first time, really, that a lot of people from the upper echelons of Russian society actually wanted to read a Russian novel, because, there was so much of their milieu being depicted in the sort of Petersburg chapters, for example. So it was very, very popular. But as we know from later on, Tolstoy just turned his back on being a professional novelist. This precipitated a huge spiritual crisis, the end of Anna Karenina, far greater than the one that followed War and Peace. And in the end, he gave up his copyright and left it to his wife to get out new edition.
I find that the most incomprehensible thing of anything as an author. But I wanted to actually, sorry to interrupt, I wanted to ask you about the religion, because it obviously is a huge part, and he has a sort of Christian anarchism, I suppose it's called, sometimes, and it becomes increasingly forthright. But he's also, I suppose, he's sort of foretaste of a modern campaigner, in that I think I'm repeating stuff you've written, but things like vegetarianism and the environment and other issues that should now be very, I don't know what the word is, so fashionable. He was very much at the forefront of that as well, on top of the religion.
I think he was ahead of the times, actually, being a vegetarian, but in the idea of downsizing. So his big idea was everyone should do manual labor and work the land. I mean, he was pretty radical because he believed in the abolition of private property. So that's where the link with the anarchists comes. But that meant that, yes, he waived his copyright. He gave up his aristocratic title. The rest of the family still kept theirs, but he was the only one who actually had, was born into it, and he gave it up. And he had this incredibly effective publicity machine going from the very beginning. And because he was so well connected. And it begins with the very first work he writes after Anna Karenina, which is his spiritual autobiography, Confession, which he submitted for publication, thinking it would, come out in a journal. But it was rejected by the spiritual censor because it was so inflammatory from their point of view, because he's already going against organized religion and the Russian Orthodox Church in particular. So it's published by a revolutionary press in Geneva. And then very soon he starts acquiring followers who are equally disenchanted with the Orthodox Church and its support of violence, because it's essentially a department of state. It's run by a layperson. I mean, that's the crucial thing to understand. In 1700, the last Russian patriarch, Adrian, had died, and Peter the Great had not replaced him because he wanted a secular state, because the church had been so unbelievably powerful when he was growing up. And so he decided that there should be a chief proctor of the Holy Synod instead, who was a member of his government. And so the church was obliged to follow state policy and support the state going into war. And Tolstoy's great campaign was to fly directly in the face of that and to expose what he regarded as its hypocrisy. So he wins followers very quickly, and in particular, a very, very high-born young man called Vladimir Chetkov, who happens to be fluent in English because his mother has been a follower of Lord Radstock. And this is also reflected in Anna Karenina. This becomes very, very popular amongst these disenchanted Orthodox believers. The idea that, the kingdom of God is within you, as is the title of one of Tolstoy's greater spiritual works. The idea that, independent Bible study means that you can have your own Christianity. You don't have to go along to an Orthodox church and surrender to the mysticism and be very passive. It's much more active. So Cherkov's mother was the great follower of Radstock and encouraged him when he came to Russia before he got banned. And Cherkov had spent a year living in England. And so he was very well placed to start translating Tolstoy's works. What I Believe was the next major work. And it's striking that these translations were published in English at the same time as the novels appeared. And really, until the translations of Constance Garnett and Elmer Maud, he was better known as a kind of spiritual and social crusader. They had an incredible impact. And The Kingdom of God is Within You, which came out in 1893, there were like 4 translations in English within a year of its publication. Of course, they were all banned in Russia. He was a samizdat author, but it was an incredibly well-run operation and made Tolstoy one of the first great international media celebrities.
Rosamund, after all these extraordinary years of Russian history since Anna Karenina was published and since Tolstoy's death, is there something we can still learn about Russia today from reading the novel?
Well, I think that the novel gives one unparalleled insight into Russia of the 1870s, but it's really quite timeless. And it speaks to Russia's uneasy relationship with Western Europe. This is a topic which is there in the background of all the great works of literature. And it's very much at the forefront today, isn't it? And it's been something that has been crucial, really, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, is where does Russia stand in relation to the rest of the world, and in particular to the West. And has led to where we are today. I'm not a political analyst at all, but I think we can do no better than read these great novels if we want to understand the Russian psyche better. And, we need to read Dostoevsky at the same time. I mean, Dostoevsky wrote a famous review of Anna Karenina while it was being published and thought it was an extraordinary work of art. And then when he got to the end where Tolstoy was expressing all these unpatriotic views, he came out very strongly against it. But, of the two, only Tolstoy had actually served in the army. He'd actually been a soldier. And I think that speaks to both sides of Russia. The one that is incredibly patriotic, I think it's very, very hard for us to take on board. And then the intelligentsia historically has had very, very different views.
Thanks so much for your time, Rosamund. That's been fascinating.